Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the lecture. We will start the lecture in 4 minutes. All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the lecture on trade dimensions of EU policies. First of all, let me thank you all very much for hanging in there and staying very up to everything with regard to lectures, assignments, and and everything. We all know that it's very difficult times for the moment, but we try to adjust, and we hope everything is going well with all of you. If there are any issues, please feel free to reach out and contact us. We will then try to answer as quickly as possible. Now for the lecture today, we will first of all build a bit further on what we ended up last time, and then we're going to go further into, let's say, the different types of trade instruments. Before we start, let me see if that works. Before we start, can I please ask you to go via your browser to Poll Everywhere? So that's pollev.com and then /Axel Marx 044 to register there, because we're going to use the Poll Everywhere a couple of times throughout the lecture, and it would be good if you can already register, and then we can use it later on. So you can leave it open on your laptop or computer. Just that you know, for the moment there is no poll open, so you will not see a question, but it will allow you to register there, and then we can use it later on in the lecture. So last time we actually focused or started up with EU trade policy, and we looked at what type of competence it was and where to fit it in the types of competences, what the main objectives are as they were defined in the treaty, and how these main objectives are linked or embedded in the broader set of principles and objectives underlying EU external policy. And then we turn to the more specific aims of trade policy, and we introduced to you the Trade for All strategy. And there we already started to discuss some of the key elements in the Trade of All strategy. And we ended up with discussing the importance of transparency and how transparency feeds into democratic control and accountability mechanisms of EU trade policy. A last part of the strategy focuses on what they called a trade policy based on values. And throughout the next lectures, we will see or hear several of these elements come back again. The trade policy based on values consists of a few components as they are laid out in the document. First of all, ensuring that European consumers can be confident in the products they buy in a global economy. Products have to comply with a whole series of EU health, safety, consumer protection, labor and environmental rules and standards. And the lecture you attended by Amy Bradford really focused on that. And it's not only that products made in the EU should comply with all these criteria, but also very importantly, all the products which are imported here. And in that way, the EU tries also through its trade policy, through its trade agreements and other instruments, make sure that there is compliance with these standards and rules. Second, very important aspect of the Trade for All strategy is to promote sustainable development and using trade policy to promote the social and environmental pillars of sustainable development. And that actually pops up in almost all of the instruments which we will discuss. So at the bottom of the slide, you see references to the EU FTAs, which are the free trade agreements, which systematically provide provisions on trade and sustainable development. And we will have a separate lecture on that next Friday. There's the GSP Plus EBA scheme, which promotes and supports sustainable development and good governance. And we will have a lecture on that after the Easter break. But also on the multilateral level, and that's the first bullet you see, is that the EU is playing an important role, for instance, in making sure that the negotiations on the environmental goods agreement at the WTO progress. And the environmental goods agreement, it's one of the agreements currently in discussion at WTO, really aims to facilitate trade in green technologies like renewable energy, waste management, air pollution control systems, and all types of different technologies and instruments to combat climate change and protect the environment. And the underlying idea for this type of agreement is to really reduce tariffs on these green products very substantially, so that there are more incentives for these products to be developed, and that actually through green technology, a lot of environmental issues can be addressed. And that's one of the areas in which the EU is working. It's also one of the approaches the EU can take in free trade agreements, but we will return to that on Friday. Third element is making sure that there is a responsible management of supply chains or value chains. And that's what we link to what we introduced at the beginning of the course, is that trade and the global economy is increasingly characterized by the fact that it's taking place through global value chains. And these global value chains can be used in one way or another to try to put pressure downward in the value chain on producers in non-EU countries to comply with a whole set of regulations and requirements. And after the Easter break, we will have a separate lecture on what we call market access regulation, but that's basically regulation which tries to make sure that there are sustainability concerns throughout the supply chain of producers bringing goods into the European market. And there we will also introduce the idea of due diligence, which is a key concept which I was not yet able to explain at the start of the lecture, but which I will introduce there. And that's the whole idea that the producers in every step of the production process have to make sure that they comply with a set of environmental and social norms. And the EU has currently quite a few specific actions or regulations in place which try to do that. Then a fourth element is to promote fair and ethical trade schemes. And if you remember well the lecture by Charlene on voluntary sustainability standards, there are many of those currently operating. And the EU sees them as a potential tool, let's say a non-governmental tool, to make value chains and supply chains far more sustainable. And in different ways, they promote these fair and ethical trading schemes through trade agreements, through all types of different actions. And that's where they actually want to integrate these non-state elements into what the EU is promoting. And when we talk about FTAs on Friday, or when we talk about market access regulation after the Easter break, you will see that these voluntary sustainability standards or fair and ethical trading schemes also play a role. Important fifth element is that there's a, let's say, red line going through all trade policies and trade instruments, and that's focusing on promoting and defending human rights. And the idea is that human rights are, let's say, a conditio sine qua non, which has to be complied with for foreign countries or traders to trade with Europe. And there are provisions of that incorporated in the FTAs and in GSP, and we will discuss more in depth how that is done and whether that's working and what some of the issues are related to that. Final element when we talk about a trade policy based on values is that the EU tries to incorporate elements of good governance and especially trying to combat corruption or unfair practices with regard to a trade in their trade policies. And then later today, we started with using trade defense measures. That's one of the ways the EU tries to combat corruption, but also in GSP and in other schemes. That's very fast, and in a nutshell, some of the key, let's say, values and norms which the EU tries to, let's say, operationalize in trade instruments. And we will go into them far more in depth when we will be discussing the different trade instruments. But that's just for you to have some kind of, let's say, an umbrella and a background of some of the key values and norms which are integrated in trade policy throughout the EU. Now, maybe before we start the next part of the lecture, it's also good to think a little bit about whether there is, let's say, a belief among citizens of the EU whether this integration of values in trade policy is really taking place. And here we go to our first question I want to ask you through poll everywhere, is that do you think a majority of Europeans think that the EU is doing this? So what I will now do, I will go to the poll everywhere software. I will open up the question. You can answer the question whether you think a majority of Europeans think that the EU is doing this. Once you have answered the question, you have to return back to the webinar software to see the responses. So we'll try to activate this now. So now you can start answering. And if you go back to the GoToWebinar software, you will see the responses of everybody. And you will see that it's actually fairly balanced in terms of whether you think the EU really integrates values in its trade policy. A little majority thinks it does. It's a minority, a small minority has a bit of doubts, and you will see in a few minutes that the result you come up with is almost identical on what European citizens as a whole think. But before we do that, I have a second question for you. And that is, as you might expect, there might actually be quite a bit of variation between what citizens from different EU member states think and which citizens from which EU member states, so you have to give the name of an EU country, EU member state. Do you believe they think that the EU is promoting values to trade more? And then the next question later on, I will ask for which countries you think citizens think it's not pursuing or promoting values to trade. So Germany pops up a lot, Sweden, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Nordic countries, Benelux as a whole. So most of you think that northern countries, Germany, Sweden, the citizens of those countries think the EU was promoting values through trade. Some also pop up with France, Lithuania. Okay, then if we go back and we go to the third question. Citizen from which EU member state do you think that the EU is not promoting values to trade? And that question you should be able to see now. So here we see Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, Italy, Greece, France coming out quite strongly. So France pops up in both answers. Austria, to a lesser degree, comes in here. Somebody writes Eurosceptic countries, so and the ones which are more protectionist, but the overall outcome is more of related to Hungary, Greece, Italy, France, and then to a lesser degree Romania, Croatia, Slovakia, and so on. So now, thank you very much for answering. Now, if we go to the responses, and this is results from a Eurobarometer, which tried to poll on EU citizens whether they thought that EU trade policy is also taking into account these values. Is that, first of all, if you look at the EU 28, which is a little bit right from the middle on your screen, you will see that 56% agree that the EU is, or think that the EU is integrating values in their trade policy, and that's actually the same percentage as what came out of the class. And then 29% disagree, 9% don't know, and then 6% responded in the, let's say it's an open response, but they indicated that it depends a bit on the trading partner or the EU is dealing with. But overall, 56% is believes that the EU is promoting these values through its trade policy. Then, when we look at the variation between countries, there we actually saw that France came out in the two responses as a possible country where citizens thought the EU was promoting values to trade, but also where citizens do not think. And actually in France, there's, let's say, the least belief in terms of what EU citizens think in terms of how the EU is promoting their values to trade. And also, of course, on the right-hand side, where the more skeptical citizens are included in this respect, are in Italy, Bulgaria, and Greece, which also came up in your answers. Maybe a little bit surprising. Germany is aligning very much with the middle of Europe, but it's not outspokenly thinking the EU is promoting its values to trade. While on the other side, some of the countries which citizens in countries where they think that the EU is really promoting values to trade is Ireland, Malta, Finland, Cyprus, Poland, UK, and Sweden. That's on your left-hand side, and that's a bit of at odds with what some respondents or what some of you responded to the poll. And it shows that there is actually not a very clear-cut north-south or east-west divide. There's a bit of east-west divide, but also note that Lithuania, Hungary, Slovakia score actually quite high in terms of that. So it depends to a degree. I think also more on some of the cultural factors, which we also discussed last time, and which aligns a bit more or less with the general attitude of citizens towards free trade. So that's a bit of, let's say, the values which are integrated in trade policy, how that's done in the instruments we will see, and the perceptions of how with people how the EU is doing that. Now, in the next part of the lecture, and it's also still linked to the Trade for All strategy, there's another important element which the EU wants to promote, and that's the idea of changing the investment regime. And we already talked so far a lot about the trade regime, and trade is about trade in goods and services, but very closely related is that of investment, where you have European investors going abroad to invest in companies which then trade goods and services, or where you have foreign investors coming into Europe and trying to invest in companies here. And in the EU, trade and investment are both part of the common commercial policy, but on a global level, the trade regime and the investment regime are quite different. So in that respect, it's important to also understand and to know what the EU is trying to do with regard to changing the investment regime. And why that's important is that we will see that actually how investment currently is regulated on the global scale has received quite a lot of criticism. And in order to introduce that a bit further, I want you all to take and read the Vattenfall versus Germany case. That's a one-pager which was sent around via a message yesterday by Charlene, which describes a certain investment dispute between one company, Vattenfall, and a German lender, the German state. And I want you to take a few minutes to carefully read the case, and then go to Poll Everywhere and write down what you think this case is about and what is the main issue. So take some time to read the case and then go to Poll Everywhere. So I see responses coming in. One saying that it's about Germany's high environmental legislative standards breaching of EU harmonization of environmental regulation. Another one pointing out to the relationship and the possibly trade-off between different values, with on the one hand environmental protection, on the other hand equal treatment of foreign investors. And also notes that it highlights the relationship, the dubious relationship between EU member state commitments and EU harmonization of trade regulation. Somebody pointing out that's private versus public interest, using foreign investment as leverage over more strict environmental regulations. Somebody pointing out, or a few pointing out, unaccountable dispute settlement mechanism for foreign direct investment. The effect of environmental protection on let's say an already established contract, investment contract between a state and a company. Okay, somebody pointing out to the strong influence of corporations on decision making. The fact that Germany enacted additional requirements to Vattenfall, and which can be actually be seen as a technical barrier to trade. Somebody is so pointing out that by increasing environmental standards, you influence trade, and in this case, investment. So these are all, I think, getting to the core of the issue. You have a company, Vattenfall, investing heavily in an energy plant in Germany, and they of course try to make a profit out of that, and that profit is calculated on the total investment cost of developing the plant. But of course, what happens next is that Germany's environmental regulations get tightened through political processes of more attention for green issues and other aspects. And that, of course, the tightening of environmental regulation will increase the cost of building a plant. And if you increase the cost, then of course the return on investment, the return on the investment value might decrease. And that's what Vattenfall did not like. And they went to a court or an arbitration tribunal, which is called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. And you have quite a few of these tribunals out there. And as we will see in a few minutes, that's one of the contentious issues. So you can go to these courts, and then there's a ruling or then out of court settlement on what happens, on what needs to happen. Now, before we go a bit further into this ISDS, please also consider the next question in the poll. And I have given 3 answers of the possible outcome. So if you read the last part of the handout, it describes what's the outcome. And the outcome can be that the company gets what it wants, that the state might get what it wants, but also that the arbitration panel finds a good balance between what both parties want. And if I can see the response, actually nobody of you thinks that the company is getting what, that the state is getting what it wants, but most of you think that the company is getting what it wants, and around 12% of you think that there's a bit of a, let's say, fair balance between both. Now, a final question related to this case is, what do you think of the outcome? Do you think it's fair? Or don't you think it's fair? So most of you think it's a very unfair outcome. Almost 92% think it's an unfair outcome. Now, does anybody want to tell the rest of the group why you think it's a fair outcome? There are only a few who answered that. Or why you think it's an unfair outcome. So if you raise your hand, I will unmute you, and then you can talk to the rest of the group and tell us why you think the outcome is unfair, or why you think the outcome is fair. Who wants to raise their hand and answer to the whole group? So I have Robert, I have Tim. Robert, I will give you the floor first. Robert, can you start?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I genuinely think Vattenfall versus Germany is quite unfair due to the fact that the Vattenfall company gets the investor state dispute settlement grants, like as in it gets a lot of powers out of the pure legislation, the trade legislation given. Is it given by the EU or not? This is what I would want to know. And in part, I find it unfair because Germany also complies with the climate change regulations. I've read over here. Yeah, to quote, the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change having alerted the public to the impending climate change. So therefore, I think like both Germany and both Vattenfall both comply with the EU regulation and left corrected. But I find it unfair due to the fact that, sorry for my phone, due to the fact that the company is not at all accountable democratically. So it's not the will of the people involved over here, but it's rather the will of the corporates.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Maybe a very quick answer to your question, whether it's EU environmental law or not, which is imposed in Germany. Environmental policy is a shared competence. So there are certain aspects of environmental regulation, also in this case, which come from the EU and which need to comply with, but the state can, at the Länder level in Germany, and also on the federal state level, can impose additional environmental legislation or more stricter environmental rules. So there is, let's say, there's the origin of the environmental regulation comes from two levels. But I recall from your answer that that one of the important elements why it's unfair is that a company can actually pursue its personal or specific interest against a more, let's say, democratic system like the state, which actually voted for those environmental regulations, and can actually have as a result that regulations which had the support of the democratic majority of people were, to a certain degree, frozen. I also saw the hand of Tim. So Robert, I'm going to unmute you, and I'm going to unmute Tim. Tim, can you hear us?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. I am certainly not into all the legal technicalities of this case, but after reading the text quickly, I have to assume that even though it goes against public opinion, that this is a fair outcome, simply because contracts have to be respected, pacta sunt servanda, and if all those agreements have been reached prior to those tightening of the environmental regulations, I think that even if public opinion shifts afterwards and regulations get more strict, those agreements that have been reached before that date have to be respected.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Realdo, sorry. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The thing is, my point would be more concerning the ISDSs themselves rather than the environmental policy. It is, in my opinion, very unfair that what happened with the Vattenfall and what happens usually with the ISDSs, but mainly because this comes as from a student or from a citizen. The ISDS's problem was that they were an instrument that would settle the interests of companies against states or vice versa, but they would be usually called upon by institution or investors. And in most of the ISDSs, like cases that there have been, the interest of the population or citizens has been overshadowed, and the settlements have been mostly in favor of investors and arguably like in favor of governments, because they would get the investment, and that would be the thinking behind it, that there would be a fair settlement because the government will get the investment from which the citizens or the country would profit, but at the same time environmental issues had been overshadowed by it, and thus the interest of the public and the environment. And that's why the EU has totally given up on ISDSs as of 2017 or 2016 after the failure of the TTIP.
Thank you very much. I will return to the proposals the EU is making to indeed reform. You are completely correct. They're proposing quite far-reaching reforms of ISDS. I will come back to that later in the lecture. Maybe returning quickly to one of the points Tim made, is that in the end he argued it's fair because in the end you need to respect contracts, and if you agree a contract and then afterwards you impose stricter standards on investors, that's a breach of contract. Does everybody agree with that? Does it mean that once you have an agreement on a contract that there's no possibility for states anymore to come up with stricter regulation, although that might be demanded by quite a large group of the voters and the citizens? Anybody want to comment on that? Just raise your hand and then I can give you the floor. Yes, Robert?
I generally think that to a certain degree, such as the case of environmental issues, for instance, I do believe that contracts should be rather flexible for a renewal of term. And I argued that based on governments, because natures of governments, like some of them tend to be more corrupted than the others, such as being the case of Romania with a company which supports illegal logging, such as the company of Holzindustrie Schweinhofer, an Austrian company, which has been signing state contracts since 2000. And nowadays it doesn't represent anymore the Romanian interest on it, but it still possesses a massive monopoly over the logging sector in Romania, and the contract cannot be resiliated. This is why I think contracts should be able to be renewed or
Okay,
renegotiated.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to come in? I see that some are now responding that they think the outcome is a bit more fair after discussion and goes back again. So what is at stake here, and what has been pointed out is that you have, besides trade, a lot of investments going on, which try to develop certain industries, try to develop also possible trade in goods and so on, but that these investments can sometimes be confronted with different actions by states. And these different actions by states can have an influence on the investments. And in order to regulate that, a lot of states make international investment agreements, and that's captured under the broader term of the international investment law and the national investment regime. And what do these agreements do? They create, in essence, protection for investments of foreign investors who are investing in another country. So assume that you are want to set up a factory in Brazil. You might put money, investment in a factory, an already existing factory in Brazil, take it over and develop the capacity there. So when you do that, you can have a good investment and you can develop the company as you wish. But there are also certain instances where something happens with the investment. And in the Vattenfall case, it was being confronted with bigger environmental regulations. But in some cases, labor laws change and become more strict. You have to pay a minimum wage. You can only you can only have people work for a number of hours a week. In some extreme cases, and that's why the system was set up in the first place, you invest in another country and the state just claims the investment, takes away the investment and says, well, you come here as a foreigner to invest in my country, but there's a big tax which nobody knew before, and then would seize the investment. In order to protect investors for these types of actions, the international investment agreements allow investors from one state to bring a claim against another state before an investment tribunal. They can, let's say, try to make sure that their investment is saved. And this international investment tribunal, it's called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, as we heard before. And the specific thing about a case before an ISDS is that you don't have to try to go first through a domestic court, like first using Brazilian courts to safeguard the investment in the example, but you directly go to an international tribunal. And the claims for these investment disputes can be very high, and they can run up into the billions, as you could also see in the Vattenfall case. So sometimes it's about very big investments, but it's also possibly about very big compensation. Now, what's specific about investment is that, unlike with the international trade regime and trade law, what we saw in the case of the WTO, there is no multilateral agreement on international organizations. So there's been a lot of attempts by the OECD, by the WTO, by other organizations to create a multilateral agreement on investment, but they all have failed. And what you end up is a patchwork of many different IIAs, so international investment agreements. And for the moment, there are more than 2,600 of these investment agreements in force. And that's basically between different countries in the world. And one country can have 80 investment agreements with 80 other countries. And if you have the investment agreement, you recognize an international tribunal which might settle disputes and conflicts. And in these investment agreements, which actually most of the time are quite short, there are a few important elements. One is definitions, like in most of these agreements, and especially what is defined as an investment. Then there are standards of treatment which are applicable to investors. So what can investors do and what they cannot do. And then most importantly, there's a part on dispute settlement. Where do you go when there is disagreement between an investor and a state? And you have a few of these ISDS courts or tribunals and in the world. Some are linked to the World Bank and to other organizations, but you have a few of those where you as an investor can go to and claim compensation if you think that something has happened. And in terms of standards of treatment, very importantly, these investment treaties stipulate what a state can do and cannot do. And there is a difference here between direct expropriation and indirect expropriation. With direct expropriation, it's meant that states cannot take the investment by an investor. So in the extreme example or case I gave before, it's not allowed by the state in an investment agreement when a foreign investor comes in to seize the investment or seize part of the investment, or argue, well, if you invest 1 billion euros, you need to pay 250 million for us to have this investment recognized. And that's quite straightforward, that states cannot do that. Another aspect regulated is called indirect expropriation, and that occurs where the investor retains legal title to the investment, but its value has been drastically reduced or destroyed by actions of the government. And that's a bit what happened to Vattenfall, not to a large degree, but the company can still do the investment for the amount, but due to regulatory actions by the state, the value of the investment has decreased significantly. And that can be due to social standards, labor rights, environmental standards, but different types of government action. It can also be the case that once, as a company, you do an investment and you actually expect that the state, through its procurement policies, might buy quite a significant part of the services and goods you produce, and they don't do that at a later stage, so then that investment loses value. So there can be different types of modalities in which an investment takes place, and when these modalities are influenced by state action, that might actually trigger some kind of a dispute. And these disputes are then brought in front of an international arbitration panel or an ISDS panel. Very important to understand and to know, and what you also saw in the Vattenfall case, is that this dispute is brought by a private actor, a company or an investment firm against a state. So it's not state to state, it's not one state bringing another state before a tribunal. It's the possibility of a private actor or a private interest to hold the state to account in front of an international tribunal. And over the last years, we have seen many of these claims. And the Vattenfall case I gave to you is an example, or it's based on the website of an NGO which tracks these types of cases. And if you go to the NGO's website, which was indicated on the handout, you will find many more cases. And also, if you go to websites of UNCTAD and other international organizations, you will find several of these cases, but there are quite a few. Important also to note that the last bullet is that the remedy or the outcome of a claim before an international arbitration is almost always a monetary compensation. In some cases, it can also be a freeze of regulation or making sure that regulation is not implemented to the full extent, which was a bit the case in the Vattenfall versus Germany case. But most important, there's always a very strong monetary compensation. And these monetary compensations can be extremely high. So they can go into millions of even billions of dollars. Finally, and that's also an important element to the current system, which is heavily criticized, is that the awards or the compensation which are given by the ISDS tribunals are final, and there is no way to appeal. So mostly in courts, when you are not, let's say, in agreement with the final outcome of a court ruling, there are possibilities to oppose that. And in the case of the WTO, for instance, if there is, after a first ruling, a disagreement, you can go to an appellate body, you can have a review, you can bring in additional arguments and so on. That's not the case with an arbitration tribunal in terms of investment. So from a rule of law perspective, that triggers a lot of debates on whether that's a fair procedure and a fair process to deal with these issues. So there are many problems and controversies related to the current approach of investor-state dispute settlement in the current international investment agreements. And some of these are controversies are, as we've seen, related to the arbitration process. But some are also related to the fact that the international investment agreements have quite specific and strong provisions protecting investment, but everything related to these side effects which have to deal with regulatory capacity of states to regulate environment, consumer health, and these types of things are almost not included. There are references in general to sustainable development and the right to social and environmental regulation, but there is no very fixed types of provision providing more detail on that. That, of course, then leads to what some might see as significant intrusion into the domestic policy space. And it's one of the reasons why I chose the Vattenfall case, is because what you see happening here is that although there's a demand for stricter environmental regulation, a single the opposition by a single actor, in this case Vattenfall, can hollow out the ability of a state to really pursue such an environmental policy. And when you want to read more about these types of cases, you will see that there's often mentioning that it creates a lot of regulatory chill, in the sense that it might prohibit the further development of regulation. And that's actually also, I think Tim pointed out, that once you have a contract, and you of course have to abide by the contract, the fact that afterwards you have less capacity to further develop policies might create that you create some kind of a chill or a standstill type of effect in terms of what can be done in different regulatory areas. And then of course there is the arbitration process itself, which is heavily criticized, because first, there are inconsistent decisions. With that, it's meant that since you have multiple tribunals, and even within tribunals, the judgments are not always very consistent. Some cases allow for more environmental regulation, for instance, and then in that case rule out on the cases more in favor of the state rather than the investor. But there are a lot of examples where that's just the opposite. Second, there's a big issue on lack of transparency, because it's not always clear on what type of information and evidence these cases and these disputes are settled. And there's a lot of, let's say, lack of transparency also for external stakeholders to monitor what's really been discussed and also what's the outcome, because some of the cases end up with some kind of a settlement. A third issue relates to the background of arbitrators in a ISDS panel, and there's a criticism of that it's actually a very close group of people who are sometimes judges, sometimes are lawyers in front of a tribunal, who knows the in and outs of all these investment agreements. They know how to, let's say, play the game very well, but there's a lot of conflict of interest, because if you are to one hand on one panel a judge, and on the other, in another case, one of the lawyers, you might want to, how should I say, align a little bit what you want to achieve as a lawyer with how you're ruling as a judge. And some have criticized it, that the judges are a bit biased towards investors, which are often are offering hiring the same type of people who then become lawyers in different cases. A fourth very important issue, and that's raised by quite a few of developing countries, is that since all these cases directly happen on the international level, you get a marginalization of domestic courts, and there's actually no way that domestic courts can be involved, and that actually creates the fact that domestic courts are set aside or set offside, not to be involved in these types of cases. And then finally, that's what I just said, the whole procedure, which does not allow for any appeal, which has been criticized quite heavily. So given that state of play, and given that type of issues, there are currently quite a few things on the table to reform the system. And after the break, I propose we have a 10-minute break or 8-minute break, and we reconvene at 12:15. I will go into a bit of the proposals which are made by the EU. So let's say we meet again in 7 minutes at 12:15. So welcome back, everybody. Everybody back and tuned in. So before the break, we introduced briefly the current investment regime, gave some examples of what it's about, and highlighted some of the criticisms and the issues which are being discussed. Now, for the next part, I would like to ask you all to take the Trade for All strategy that was also sent around yesterday, and actually also the week before, and then read carefully the part 4.1.2, pages 21 and 22, and then go to Poll Everywhere and write an answer about what the main focuses of this part and what is the Commission actually proposing in regards to this global investment regime. So read that part and then go to the Poll Everywhere to answer the question on what the EU is proposing. And once you answer the question on Poll Everywhere, don't forget to go back to the webinar software so you can also see the responses of some of the other students. So we already have one answer in, and the student suggested that it's about boosting investment and restore and modernize the investment regime, including also WTO reform. And now the answers are coming in to reform the dispute mechanism of WTO, but importantly also transformation of the old investor-state dispute settlement into a public investment court system, including the creation of an appeal tribunal, imposing a clear code of conduct to avoid conflict of interest, and stronger emphasis on the right of the state to regulate. So that addresses some of the problems and the criticisms on procedure, regulatory show, which we highlighted before the break. Important element there that the EU should take the lead in this and really use its market power to push for this new investment strategy. So the EU is seeing itself as one of the, let's say, leaders in this respect. And Commission should take the role in coming up with ideas for modernizing the investment regime. That it does not only support the idea to change the regime, but also it should be leading the regime. And it actually sees us doing this in the context of specific types of negotiations like the TTIP. So indeed, the main message of that part is that the EU, in its trade for all strategy, already announced quite strongly that it wants to reform the investment regime and that it actually wants to become or take a leading role in doing that. It's also important to understand in this context what I mentioned before, that actually quite a few of the multilateral initiatives in the OECD and in the WTO have failed. So the EU is still thinking about pursuing something multilateral, but in a first instance based on or integrated in some of the more bilateral agreements they are currently developing with certain states. So that's what's being proposed. And so there's a need to rebalance the arbitration system. And I think a few important elements is that there is a discussion on whether to eliminate ISDS altogether. So to get rid of the whole idea and system where an investor can bring a state in front of an international tribunal. And that's actually a position taken by some countries like India and South Africa, which actually proposes that all of these types of disputes have to be handled in domestic courts and not on the international level. But there are also quite a few who want to promote or propose reforms to the current system, especially to tackle what's at the bottom of the slide, what they call rule of law deficits. And that could imply constructing a permanent arbitral court-style mechanism like WTO and strengthening especially the independence of people involved in the system and have a review system. Now, in that last part of reform, that's where the EU is making several proposals. And it's also trying to integrate these proposals in current bilateral trade and investment agreements. Some of the ideas the EU developed were proposed in the TTIP, so the negotiations for a large investment and trade agreement with the US. That has stalled, but in other trade and investment agreements like CETA with Canada, Vietnam, Singapore, some of these elements have reappeared, and through this bilateral route, the EU aims to bring enough countries around the table to have a first start of a more multilateral approach. And what the EU is proposing in these agreements is that that there should be a public investment court system of first instance, so where you bring the initial complaint and case, but that there should also be an appeal tribunal, so that there should be a possibility when the outcome is heard that there might be an appeal and there might actually be a different ruling altogether. They stipulate that the judges which are appointed in this tribunal and appeal tribunal have high qualifications, and that's actually very much mimicking on the system of the WTO. And of course, as we discussed when we discussed the WTO system itself is also under attack, but less for issues related to the judges. I have one question, and I will see if I can open that. And the question is by Eva Baltusova. She likes the proposal the Commission is making, but wants to know who will pay for that all. And I will come back to that question in a second. Once I went over the last bullet point, which is important for the Commission, that they have a first instance tribunal, an appeal tribunal, very much mimicked on the WTO, but also that they far more precisely define on what investors can bring claims to a tribunal, and it can be on expropriation, it can be on discrimination, that foreign investors are treated differently than domestic investors, that they cannot have when they would use the domestic courts, they have a denial of justice there or problems with access of justice, so that all these elements are far more precisely defined at the outset rather than at through the process of adjudicating these types of things. Now, related to the question of Eva, these are nice proposals, but who should pay for that? In essence, who pays for that is the members of such a tribunal. Like in all multilateral organizations, the funds to support these multilateral organizations are most of the time provided by member states, which are countries, who pay a membership fee. So when we look at WTO or when we look at UN agencies, they're actually funded by all of us taxpayers, which pay taxes to a government, and a government then decides on what to spend these taxes. And a lot of our taxes go into education policy, infrastructure, and so on. But also part of our taxes go to what we call foreign affairs, and within foreign affairs we fund embassies of a country, but we also fund participation into international organizations. So that's who would fund it. And then Eva wants to have a follow-up question about that it would be very costly. And then the question is, how can you force members to pay? That's a very good question, and it's very difficult to force members to pay. And actually, you give the example of the US and WTO, but the US, it's currently part of WTO, but they have suspended payments to many UN agencies. And that's, of course, always a contentious political issue, which most of the time needs to be resolved via diplomatic means. But more in general, you see a tendency that more and more states exit from international organizations. And that also means paying and not longer paying their fees, which of course has an influence on whether these agencies or organizations can work, and that's of course crucial. And what you can see is that if members are not willing to support them, these types of organizations financially, they will not be able to operate. The overall question is whether for a country it makes sense to invest or pay membership fees into such a court, in the sense that they also lose money when they have to pay compensations to other international tribunals to a large degree, on which they have much less of a say in terms of procedures, in terms of process and so on. So I think the financial question and whether countries are willing or not to engage will also depend a little bit on the cost-benefit analysis they make for it. Quite a few people argue that international organizations are in the first place created because they reduce transaction costs and make it actually interesting for countries to engage in that. But if you're interested in the question about the incentives of countries to engage in multilateral action, you can send me an email, and I can also send you some further literature on that. So that's the current proposal by the EU. And if you contrasted it with what is at present at ISDS and what a multilateral investment court might be, is that it will be not ad hoc. So tribunals are not set on a case-by-case basis, but it will be permanent. It will be far more independent in terms of who is involved. It might create more predictability because you have a fixed number of judges who are involved and who can actually create some kind of jurisprudence on the cases they see. It has to be noted there that, of course, some of the debates currently in the WTO also resolve around this issue, and actually countries like the US are quite critical of WTO because the judgments, the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO makes is creating precedents to which they did not always agree beforehand. So this predictability has some advantages, but also has some drawbacks. It would be more comprehensive in terms of that there will be a appeal. There is the issue of cost, because it might be in the end more cost effective than having all these different types of ad hoc types of ISDS codes. So there might be let's say a transaction cost argument related to that. And then finally, it will be hopefully far more transparent, or the proposals which are currently made try to ensure that a multilateral investment court in the future will be far more transparent than what's currently happening under the ISDS, where the results of the disputes and so on, where there is actually very limited information about that. So that's on investment what the EU is proposing. That's on investment what the EU is pursuing. It has a very strong multilateral dimension. It has a very strong element where the EU wants to push their, let's say, preferences on the global scale, mainly to address some of the negative effects of the current regime with regard to investment. Currently, there are quite a few working groups working on investment reform, and you can follow that through what is called the UNICITRAL working group, which tries to combine all different types of proposals, and where you can actually follow the current debates. Given the current deadlock at the WTO, there is a little bit less also progress made on investment, but of course the political situation can change in the future, and then there might be again more movement with regard to the investment regime and to come up with some kind of a multilateral investment gold type of thing. Maybe it's interesting also when you compare or contrast the current trade regime with the investment regime, is that some of the issues which are currently raised in the WTO on the dispute settlement mechanism, like the precedents they create, which might be far going by the strength of the dispute settlement mechanism themselves, is much related that you have a very strong independent international tribunal, which has, let's say, very strong rule of law features, while on the other hand, in the investment regime, there is a criticism that you have an international regime which actually scores less well on a lot of these rule of law criteria in terms of access to justice, fair compensation, procedures to appeal, and so on. And there you have a bit of the opposite criticism of what you have with regard to the WTO. But this is one of the areas I think is very interesting to follow in terms of what the EU is doing, and also towards the future, how the developments might go with regard to a more multilateral system. So that's, let's say, in a nutshell, over the last 2 lectures, what's currently in terms of principles, objectives, and strategies, what the EU is proposing and what they want to pursue. Now, in terms of how that effectively happens, there we need to start looking at the different instruments which the EU had at its disposal to pursue these objectives. And that will be the main focus of the next few lectures. And we'll start today with looking at trade defense measures and adjustment measures. Then we go to free trade agreements. What are they and how is the EU trying to operationalize these objectives and principles of free trade agreements? And what do we know so far about how that is working? Then free trade agreements are, in essence, agreements between the EU and another partner or a few other partners. You also have a system which is called GSP Plus at EBA, and I will explain that more, but it's basically a general scheme of preferences for least developed countries to access the European market. And the EU is, with quite a few other countries, has such a system in place, which tries to promote economic development in these developed countries, but does that on certain conditional basis. And then you have quite a few regulatory tools. We call them market access regulations, which the EU can use to influence trade flows going in and out of the EU. And we will also cover quite in depth all these different measures, because that's actually where the core of the, let's say, implementation lies of EU trade policy. So we'll start with trade defense instruments and structural adjustment. And here we'll introduce 4 measures or 4 types of instruments which are important for you to know. One is anti-dumping measures, trying to prevent dumping on the European market. Second, and partially related, is anti-subsidy measures, which might distort products coming on the European market because they receive subsidies in another country. And these first 2 elements, or first 2 measures, are very important to tackle what's called unfair trade, or let's say distortion by trade by other firms, states, and economic actors with whom the EU trades. Then thirdly, that's less related to unfair trade, but are the so-called safeguard measures, which can be put in place to ensure that when there are sudden changes in the economic environment and through trade certain EU companies and industries might lose out very quickly. The EU can impose certain measures to, let's say, adjust to that. And then we have structural adjustment programs or structural adjustment measures, which have to deal with how do we need to change economically and socially to a changed to a changed economic system, which is influenced by trade. So as we have shown in the beginning of the lecture, trade creates jobs, but it also destroys jobs in a certain country, and how to make sure that these types of adjustments from an economy based on a certain sectors to an economy based on other sectors can take place, that falls on the structural adjustment measures. And in a first step, there's often these safeguard measures which are put in place, which might facilitate this adjustment. Now, let's first start, before we go into the different measures, I will show you a little video which introduces some of these elements. I will first show you the video, and then we will go again to Poll Everywhere, and I will ask you what are some of the key issues introduced in the video. I will play the video in a second. Just that you all know, the video is subtitled, and so you can follow the story of the video via the subtitles. Some of you might not hear the audio because it depends sometimes on your own laptop settings, but if you don't hear the video, don't worry about it. As long as you read the subtitles, you can follow the story, and you will also be able to answer the questions. So I will now start the video.
Celý môj život sa točí okolo bicyklov, keďže môj otec založil túto továreň v roku 1991. Milujem to, čo robím, aj napriek tvrdej konkurencii. A som hrdá na to, že naša spoločnosť hrá dôležitú úlohu v našej komunite.
Salve, sono Moreno. Da più di 30 anni lavoro con i produttori di biciclette. Ho assistito alla grande innovazione tecnologica della nostra industria. I nostri piccoli produttori hanno contattato la nostra associazione European Bicycle Manufacturers Association, molto preoccupati per l'aumento delle importazioni di bici elettriche dalla Cina popolare. Ho pertanto informato la Commissione europea affinché potesse investigare. Avevamo a rischio più di 200 piccole e medie imprese e 90.000 posti di lavoro.
Mam na imię Michał. Po otrzymaniu zawiadomienia od producentów rowerów elektrycznych Unia Europejska wysłała 2 zespoły. Jeden zespół zajmował się sprawą w Europie, a drugi zespół w Chinach. Byłem w zespole, który odwiedził producentów i importerów rowerów elektrycznych w Europie. Wysłuchaliśmy ich obaw i zweryfikowaliśmy dane po to, aby uzyskać jak najlepszy obraz wpływu importu tańszych rowerów elektrycznych z Chin.
Olen Arto. Kansainvälisten kauppasäädösten mukaisesti saimme vierailla kiinalaisissa tuotantolaitoksissa. Siellä meille selvisi, miten niissä voitiin valmistaa sähköpyöriä niin halvalla. Kävi ilmi, että Kiinan hallitus järjesti tietyille yrityksille alihintaisia lainoja ja polkupyörien osia. Tämän epäreilun kilpailuedun vuoksi kiinalaiset tuottajat pystyivät myymään tuotteitaan alle markkinahinnan, mikä aiheutti vahinkoa eurooppalaisille yrityksille. Näiden tietojen ja yhteiseurooppalaisen tiimimme selvitysten perusteella EU päätti asettaa Kiinasta tuotaville sähköpyörille ylimääräiset tuotitullit.
Ich bin Oliver. Täglich werden im Hamburger Hafen etwa 30.000 Container aus der gesamten Welt umgeschlagen. Wir vom Zoll sorgen dafür, dass hierbei auch besondere von der EU auferlegte Zölle, zum Beispiel auf E-Bikes, gezahlt werden.
Volám sa Monika a prevádzkujem slovenský rodinný podnik na výrobu elektrobicyklov. Zamestnávame okolo 80 ľudí, takže naša firma má veľký význam pre našu komunitu. Keď som zbadala na našom trhu čoraz viac elektrických bicyklov z Číny, začala som sa obávať, že nebudeme konkurencieschopní a budeme musieť zamestnancov prepustiť. Som rada, že Európska únia prijala opatrenia na ochranu našej firmy a živobytia našich zamestnancov.
Well, how is your father?
Busy, really busy currently.
Busy production.
And thanks to the anti-dumping, we are receiving new and new orders.
That's good. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
We have to make sure that everyone is playing with the same rules.
So that's a short video made by the European Commission itself on an introduction into some of the issues in terms of trade defense. Let us now go to poll everywhere. And you can answer the question of what are some of the key issues introduced in the video. Somebody says anti-dumping. Unfair competition, anti-dumping as a result of Chinese price dumping on its e-bikes. Somebody mentions ISDS. Illegal state subsidies distorting the market prices. Anti-dumping measures placed by the EU to protect against unfair competition. So these elements come back a lot. Cheaper products from bigger companies undermine small businesses. So that's from bigger companies from China. State support by China. Uneven playing field. So there's a lot of answers related to, let's say, anti-dumping subsidies provided by China, and that's true. What might happen if you don't put any measures in place? What did they say in the video? What would the result be if there are no measures put in place to address these anti-dumping and anti-dumping of e-bikes on the European market, and also which was that it was the Chinese government which subsidized these e-bikes? What would have been the company's consequences? Somebody else was losing a lot of jobs as a consequence of importing cheaper Chinese bikes. I think that's an important element as well. Protecting local business. So if you don't address these issues, then quite a few small businesses in Europe might go out of business. So loss of jobs, as mentioned quite a few times. I also think that some of the main takeaways are indeed that e-bikes are sold below the market price, which was made possible to government intervention, the subsidies, but also by the provision of certain parts of making e-bikes very cheaply. And the effects might be that people are out of a job. So very sudden changes in trade can create quite important economic effects. And it's not that just, we heard here the story about one company. It's not that just one company might be hurt, but really a whole sector might be affected by these types of trade flows. So there are, what you saw in the video are some of the key elements which come back in trade defense and which also trigger these types of structural adjustment measures which might be necessary in case of we're not talking about unfair trade. This was an example where you might say the trading rules are not followed entirely and you create some kind of a situation of unfair trade. But in some cases, everybody plays by the rules, but you still create quite a bit of structural adjustment because in some countries there is more technology and know-how available to create certain products more cheaply, and then when they are exported to another country, that might undermine the position of a certain sector in that country. Now, to address these issues, especially the first two, anti-dumping and subsidies, the EU develops a range of measures. And the first one are anti-dumping measures. And what are we talking about when we talk about anti-dumping? A non-EU company is dumping if it exports a product to the EU at a price lower than the normal value of the product. And then the question is, of course, what's the normal value of a product? And that's either the product's price as sold on the home market of the non-EU companies. So that's, if we're talking about exports from Vietnam to Europe, that's the price sold on the Vietnamese market, or a price based on the cost of production and profit. And that's a price calculated based on all the parts which go into our product, the cost of those parts, and if you add that up with a certain profit margin, then you come at a certain price. As we saw in the video and in the example, the Chinese government did not only give subsidies, but they also gave parts of a bike. And of course, if you get parts of a product for free, that might actually distort the price. But these are, let's say, the normal values. And if there is a fear of anti-dumping, so that's an exporter is putting products on the European market, an anti-dumping investigation can start. And the investigation checks whether there is dumping by producers in the countries concerned. So maybe there are Vietnamese or Canadian or Russian producers putting products on the European market. An investigation also checks whether the European industry concerned suffers material injury. So sometimes demand increases so much that even if products are dumped on the European market, the demand for these products does not have an effect on the existing industry. And for instance, what we now see with the coronavirus discussions on mouth masks and so on, we get a lot of material in, but that does not necessarily have to distort the position of domestic producers. Third, the investigation looks whether there's a causal link between the dumping and the injury. So in the case of the video, the bicycle manufacturer was really losing a lot of market demand because of the cheap influx. But if that's not the case, then there is less injury and there's also no causal link. And then finally, an investigation checks whether if you put a measure in place, an anti-dumping measure in place, it will not go against a European interest. And that basically means that if you would go on the route of putting in measures that you might get retaliations by trading partners, which might actually be worse than what you gain with putting in the measure. So all these conditions have to be met before the Commission can put an anti-dumping measure in place. And these anti-dumping measures can be different. You can have an additional duty, an ad valorem duty they call it, which is a proportional tariff on the value of the good. You can also have specific duties, and there are fixed duties which are linked to certain amounts of products coming on a market. And you can have price undertakings, which basically means that the non-EU exporter, which in the first instance was dumping on the European market, agrees to sell its products at a minimum price in the EU, so that you level the price of the product, so that it's no longer it's no longer considered as dumping. And then these duties are to be paid by the importer in the EU, because here the duties can be collected, and they then are levied on these products which are or which were investigated and which were found to be part of dumping. Now, an important element is that, as we saw, the normal price is calculated on the basis of the price of the product on the domestic market, or the sum of the parts of the product in of which the product is made. But as we saw in the video, like in the case of the Chinese government providing parts of the bike, this way of calculating might be not the most appropriate way, and that's why the EU made new legislation to develop a new methodology to calculate dumping. And new legislation basically starts from the old approach, so looking at the normal price on the domestic market, or adding up the costs of the parts. But when there is found to be really strong state interference, then the domestic price of the good might be also manipulated and might actually be too low, like in the case of the free provision of bicycle parts. And if that's the case, the EU will not look only at the price on the domestic market, but it will also use other benchmarks. And that basically means that they will look at the prices of similar products in appropriate representative countries where there is no state interference. So to get a better, let's say, estimate of the real value of the product, and to establish whether dumping has occurred. So that's in a nutshell the anti-dumping measures. And I have a question. A hand raised. Wait 1 second. Maria, I will unmute you. She did no longer raise her hand. So if you have a question, I propose you send it to me. It's now 1 o'clock. So in the next lecture on Friday, I will also introduce anti-subsidy measures, go into safeguard, and then structural adjustment. And before and after that, we will go into free trade agreements as another set of instruments which the EU uses to implement the principles from its trade policy. Before I leave you, I will have one question to ask, because they asked whether we have class on Friday, and we will have a final class on Friday. Normally, I had a guest lecturer coming from the European Commission, Ms. Madeleine Turninga, to explain to you how the EU is approaching FTAs and sustainable development in FTAs. But I will have to replace her, and I will do the lecture myself on the FTAs, because the Commission is also closed, and she cannot do it via the webinar software. So we will have a lecture next Friday from 11 till 1, I will also do it through this software. So I wish you a very nice afternoon. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to let us know. And then I will see you back on Friday. Bye-bye. Maria, are you still there? Maria, can you hear us?